Ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Leece, for the benefit of those who haven't met me before. Our panel is the same panel that we've had this afternoon, and we've received a number of questions, too many for me to put to the panel this afternoon, but what I have tried to do is to... Okay. What I have tried to do is group some of the questions, and I will present them as best I can generically on your behalf to the panel. And there may be a few individual questions by way of follow-up that we will be able to insert, but we have to finish right on the dot of 5, so I've got to keep a fair eye on the time, and I'm sure the President will make sure that I don't go over time. The first issue I will present to the panel generically. It deals with diplomacy and non-alignment. The public version of Australia's Defence Strategic Review was released on the 24th of April. It is blunt in saying we can only defend ourselves in conjunction with our allies in the Indo-Pacific. To this end, effective diplomacy underpinned by credible deterrent will be vital. An issue which arises from this is the acquisition of conventionally armed and nuclear-powered submarines, the so-called SSNs, are to be a key element of that deterrence. Indonesia, and to a lesser extent Malaysia, however, have expressed their opposition to this Australian SSN capability. Indonesia saying it would not allow Australian SSNs to pass through the Indonesian archipelago. More broadly, India and Indonesia historically have been key members of the non-aligned movement, although India more recently has taken a more flexible position in response to China's rise. Given that background, the question that I've been asked to put is, how significant are these diplomatic challenges, and how should Australia go about seeking to resolve them? And I wonder if the High Commissioner could start. Would you be prepared to start, Manpreet?
Certainly. Thank you very much. I don't think I'll comment too much on the last part of the question. That would be for our Australian colleagues to answer. But on the first part about diplomacy and non-alignment, well, many of you would recall, some may not know about it, the history of non-alignment and why the non-alignment movement was formed. This was soon after a spate of independence of colonies following the end of the Second World War, and the legacy, the history, the memory of colonialism, of the wars, of what the colonies suffered because of great power rivalries in other theatres, the rest of the world, etc., but impacted us hugely, led to a belief amongst the first few leaders of the newly independent countries like India, Indonesia, Egypt, Ghana. These leaders got together and formed what came to be known as the non-aligned movement. And the whole idea was that we don't want to get sucked into those rivalries of other, Western nations, if I may loosely use that term, which ended up causing so much misery for the entire world. People who might even have been completely disconnected from the reasons why those wars became necessary, let's say in Europe, etc. So that was the history of non-aligned movement. We wanted to sort of not be forced to join any camps. We wanted to retain our strategic autonomy, and many of us successfully did that. India continues to be a part of the non-aligned movement. We continue to fairly jealously guard our strategic autonomy. We still haven't done till this date military alliances in the usual sense that word is understood. And we also, for us directly, just as India, I mean, we also had this rather nasty experience where we were actually very bluntly told that, it's either my way or the highway. You either join, if you're not with us, you are against us. So those binary choices might come easy to some people. Certain major powers still operate only in black and white. But for us in India, there are shades of grey. And we think that those are also important. Being forced to say yes or no, black and white, is not either essential or in the national interests. There are other ways of dealing with these matters. So that was the history of non-alignment, and it's still a strong movement in terms of its membership. They still meet regularly. And another part of describing non-alignment is that you take you take positions on issues. So issue-based support or issue-based opposition or working on various issues, rather than just asking or rather than just accepting somebody's view or somebody's decision about an issue is not our way. So that's what diplomacy, non-alignment, India's own approach to these matters is about. As regards increased deterrence, those are completely sovereign choices. The advanced military capabilities or new capabilities that Australia is seeking today is entirely its sovereign determination and decision, and we as good friends of Australia entirely respect those choices. We also had to make serious choices. Australia didn't like it at the time, but I hope that there is more understanding now. In 1998, we were forced to go nuclear because of the proliferation and the actual situation immediately surrounding us in our neighborhood, which forced us to go nuclear. That was a sovereign choice we had to make sure that we had the deterrence capabilities to deter the aggressor, and that's what we did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I, Dr. Teo, could you comment from an ASEAN perspective?
Sorry.
Sure. So I'll comment generally, I think, about an ASEAN perspective, but I'll focus on Indonesia, as you mentioned specifically. So I think in terms of, if you look at Indonesia's foreign policy and its preference for a non-aligned foreign policy, I think it shares many of the same concerns as India. So no military alliances, and if you have followed past Indonesian administrations' foreign policy, you may have heard of this phrase where Indonesia wants 1,000 friends, or maybe 1 million friends and 0 enemies. Right? So I think that's generally the way that Indonesia has approached its region and its broader foreign policy. In the case of, the nuclear-powered subs and AUKUS, I agree with the ambassador here that these are sovereign choices, definitely. The concern, I think, from Indonesia and South Korea is really, I guess there are two main concerns. One, and this was particularly prominent in the early days of the AUKUS announcement, right, when we didn't really know what the details would be. So the first concern was about nuclear proliferation and arms race, right? Would the acquisition of nuclear-powered subs spark an arms race in the region? Will that potentially push countries like Japan and Korea to adopt nuclear capabilities as well? So these were the uncertainties, I think, that surrounded the debate about AUKUS in its early days. I think these days, as more information has filtered out and we get a clearer picture of what the AUKUS partnership involves, I hear less concerns in those areas. But what is still quite prominent in the debates is really the potential for exclusive I guess, unilateral arrangements to increase tensions, especially among the major powers. So Indonesia, I think, has this view as well. But recently, if you have followed what President Jokowi said maybe last week or a couple of weeks ago, he actually said that the Quad and AUKUS could serve as, or could work together with ASEAN as partners, right? So to watchers of Indonesia's foreign policy, I guess that does indicate potentially a slight shift in Indonesia's sentiments about the AUKUS and Quad. But whether that will be sustained, I mean, President Jokowi has a history of making remarks that don't get followed through. I believe at some point he did say that Australia should join ASEAN. So whether those remarks were off the cuff or whether they were a product of a conscious decision making, I think that's still a question. But with AUKUS and especially with the nuclear propelled subs, I think another issue comes up for Indonesia, which is really whether to allow the passage of the subs through its archipelagic sea lanes. So I think some Indonesian officials have said that they cannot permit the passage of the subs if they are used for conflict or they are used for offensive purposes. But whether Indonesia is allowed to ban the passage of those subs, I think under UNCLOS, I think that may actually not be possible.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the panel wish to comment on that issue? Okay, we'll move to the next issue. This also has been raised by a few questioners. They're a bit concerned about, we haven't perhaps addressed the concerns of the Pacific quite enough, of the Pacific nations. An issue which arose from the visit of the Solomons, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble reading some of the writing. An issue to arise from the visit of Samoa's Prime Minister, Fiame Naomi Matarafa, to Australia in March, was her proposal for a Pacific Union, analogous to the European Union, to consist of the Pacific Islands Forum member states. She noted that the Pacific contained the world's greatest concentration of micro-states. Her own country, Samoa, has a population of only 200,000 people, but the total land and sea territories and exclusive economic zones of the Pacific nations cover more than 30 million square kilometres, 1/5 of the Earth's surface, an area bigger than Russia, China and the United States combined. Well, the question that I tried to put together from those thoughts were, what are the merits of this proposal and how should Australia and New Zealand respond? I wonder whether Anne-Marie Brady would like to... David Fawcett's got the microphone.
I think he's just asked you, Professor.
No, I handed it to you. I handed you the baton.
There you go. A New Zealander passing the rugby ball. Look, there's been a range of proposals over the years around different relationships. I think the fact that we've only just recently seen the Pacific Islands Forum reconstitute itself and start to actually document even things like the chairmanship or the presidency of that forum. It's been a gentleman's agreement. It's a very sexist term, isn't it? But that's what it's called, a gentleman's agreement, for many years, and a number of islands felt as though they were overlooked for someone else and withdrew from the agreement. It's recently been formalised and they've all come back, and so there's even in that very important, but it's not a union per se, they're still evolving their relationships and their trust and the frameworks, and at the end of the day it's a sovereign choice for them as nations. If they choose to form something along those lines, then we'll work with them. We're certainly not pushing it, but if they chose to do it, we would work with them and see how we could optimise outcomes for those nations through that framework.
Thank you.
Well, I will speak now. So I would just say it's not they. I mean, New Zealand and Australia are part of the Pacific Island Forum too, so it would be a collective decision. So because all decisions are collective in the Pacific Island Forum, and there's definitely real efforts to strengthen the regional architecture, which in the Pacific is particularly is the Pacific Island Forum, but there's the Pacific Commission as well. And that's really important for security. Lucky us that most of the Pacific Island nations who were approached by Wang Yi last year said, we love you very much, but thank you, no thank you. We don't want a security agreement with China that excludes Australia and New Zealand. And so they are now looking to Australia and New Zealand step up. I know Australia's stepped up a lot and New Zealand needs to do more. And New Zealand is actually very conscious of that, particularly in the context of the Pacific, which is our main security priority, just like Australia. So I don't know about the Pacific Union. She also raised, Prime Minister Fiame, a matter which is very offensive to, you've had incidents in Australia of senior politicians from the Pacific turning up and being treated like criminals on your borders. They don't have visa-free access, Pacific Island nations, to our countries. And there is that was one of the other proposals that she and other leaders have raised. But there's a real tension there in things that we've done to support the Pacific, New Zealand and Australia in recent years, like the RUSI scheme, which helps our horticulture, but also drains the Pacific of key labour. And New Zealand does have, because of historical colonial reasons, Cook Island and Niue both have free access into New Zealand. There are more Cook Islanders and Niueans living in New Zealand than in their countries. Cook Islands has a human resources crisis right now. Immediately post-COVID, lots of people just went to New Zealand. So it's hard for them to get their tourism economy going. They haven't got people to do the work. And then in Samoa, we also have a quota with Samoa of considerable number of people who can apply to come and migrate to New Zealand. So this is the balance, and I think that our governments have to have that conversation with Pacific leaders. Do you really want free visa access across the Pacific? Because there is a real risk that you will depopulate your countries and make yourselves very vulnerable. So we have to talk about the best way to make the Pacific resilient. That is job number one, because if the Pacific is resilient, and that's on all levels, not just in the security of the Pacific includes non-traditional security, then New Zealand and Australia will be secure too. As New Zealand and Australian defence documents said, the Australian document in 2020, New Zealand 21, if a hostile power was to have a military or an intelligence presence in any of the Pacific states, said the New Zealand document, not just the second island chain, that would immediately have a very harmful effect on our security. And while Sogavare has assured the media that China won't in fact be stationing, setting up a military base or an intelligence base in the Solomons, they don't have to call it a base. That ginormous embassy, way larger than is needed, and that's been set up in Honiara, the PRC embassy, can host lots of military attaches and intelligence officers disguised under other roles, plus there's strategic infrastructure, which is now under the control of PRC companies in the Solomons. So we're already in this, the frog is already in boiling hot water in the Pacific right now, and we really, really need to work very hard to get our Pacific leaders up to speed with what we understand. I was really concerned when Prime Minister Fiame was here and she said that she questioned the Indo-Pacific that terminology and what was wrong with South Pacific, and I thought, gosh, hasn't there been enough briefing for her to explain the strategic environment? And maybe not. So there is a lot of work to do, and there are trusted partners in the Pacific who do want to be part of the solution, and we, as was said earlier this afternoon, we also have to be cognizant of the issues that they face, that they think are acutely important for their security, in order to get them to be part of the solution for the security of the whole of the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you. The next issue really relates to, specifically to Japan and perhaps the countries of the South China Sea. Chinese grey zone coercion, the employment by China of its so-called fishing fleets and its coast guard to deny other countries access to marine resources in the East and South China Seas, frequently in waters and shoals claimed by both China and the other country, is an increasing problem for Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, among others. The Australian Air Force and Navy too have been subject to such bullying recently in our own northern approaches. The temptation to counter such bullying kinetically is resisted by most victims to avoid escalation and miscalculation. The question that's been put is, how are such measures best countered? And I think we might start with you, Lauren.
Sure. Thanks. Okay, it's working. Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, it has become a big problem. China's grey zone tactics are a huge problem for Japan, a huge concern. And one concern Japan has had, a lot of the focus is on the South China Sea, obviously, but Japan's territorial dispute with China, which is just as big, as much of a problem, is in the East China Sea. So Japan has really tried to make a conceptual connection between those two seas, so that other countries will not just care about the South China Sea, but will also help to defend the East China Sea. And has tried to make a conceptual connection by saying there's a pattern of coercive behaviour here. It's not the South China Sea, it's also the East China Sea. I think it's very hard in terms of how you can stop this. I mean, Japan realises, for instance, that China's militarisation of artificial islands in the South China Sea, that can't be walked back. You know, that's too late. That's already happened. Japan and the US scramble, their planes around Okinawa Islands all the time. They do the maximum number already. Japan's approach, I think this is probably the best approach, is to try to strengthen the Coast Guard capabilities of those other countries around the South China Sea, so that Japan is not sort of carrying that burden with the US in that area. Yeah, and aside from freedom of navigation operations, it's really difficult to figure out what more can be done, actually. I'll see if anyone else has some sort of...
Sarah, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I agree actually with Lauren. I think it's really difficult to think of kind of a best or most appropriate way to counter grey zone activities in the South China Sea. I mean, the way I see it, I think we currently have two available options, right? One is more dialogue, more codes of conduct. So I know there's a lot of skepticism about dialogue and codes of conduct and how effective they really are. But to me, I mean, that is really, it is an option, right? The option is there. And that's what I think ASEAN has been trying to do as well, but maybe to not much success. The second option is what Lauren has said, is really to build up the capacity of regional states for deterrence, for enforcement, and so on. But with that, then you run into the problem of kind of making sure that, when an accident happens or when something happens, how do you make sure that it does not escalate? So how do you respond in a way that does not lead to escalation? Right. So that's where I think then that the first part about dialogue and communication and codes of conduct can play a role as well.
Thank you. Any other member of the panel want to comment on that? Okay. The next question is somewhat of a follow-up, but it's from Ken Broadhead, but I'm not sure I can read your writing, Ken. Can you come up here and read it for me, please? Thanks, mate. There's the microphone.
Well, I can't read it either. This is for Dr. Richardson. Japan's concerns about historical grudges held by China are well founded. Is it possible that China plans to give the Japanese a bloody nose or something as a final payback for the actions of Japan against Chinese in the 1930s and 1940s? If so, would that come as a devastating surprise to the various security groupings in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you. It's another very interesting question. I mean, my thoughts are that China probably wouldn't, go down that track, especially if it was really unprovoked. I think China definitely still does harbour a historical grudge against Japan for that period. But I think Japan's main concern is not that China's actually going to invade Japan, but it's more focused on the potential of a Taiwan crisis and what Japan would do in the event of that sort of crisis. Obviously, the Japanese and US navies do about 70% of their exercises in the South China Sea, and they anticipate that's probably where the sort of conflict would take place. It wouldn't so much be taking place, within Japan. So yeah, whether Japan would be involved in a Taiwan conflict, I mean, it's not clear. They also have a policy of strategic ambiguity. But what we've seen is under the Abe administration, sort of ironically, Abe was trying to keep a very good diplomatic relationship with China leading up to COVID, trying to stabilise the economic dimension of the relationship. But once COVID started and there was, the antagonism arose between Australia and China, between the US and China, mostly around COVID and its origins, the Japanese government started to be a lot more vocal in its support of Taiwan on various issues, vaccines and things like that, because Taiwan, as we recall, was doing very well in managing COVID in the early stages. So I think, Japan has been kind of swept up into a lot of the kind of China policies led mostly by the US, and also increasingly Australia. Those three countries are quite aligned. But yeah, in answer to your question, I don't think China would risk, trying to start any kind of war with Japan intentionally.
I'd like to respond.
Sure.
There's the issue of the Diaoyu Islands and Senkaku, and so not so much a bloody nose, but China's definitely poking and pushing, and it's a bit like, other situations, Georgia, very just a slap across the wrist for, or South Ossetia when in South Ossetia in 2008, and then the Crimea in 2014 for Russia. By not responding strongly in those situations when there's territorial incursions, then you risk even more aggressive behaviour. And so Japan has had a phenomenal amount of incursions into their air defence zone in recent years from China and also Russia up in the north, and naval incidents as well. There is certainly I wouldn't say that that the history of the Japanese invasion in China in the 1930s and 40s drives so much China's policy. It's more about recidivism and wanting to get all the territory, land and maritime territory that they can, that the CCP government can, but also there are definitely historic tensions between Japan and China that go back centuries, and about who is more dominant, who is weak and who is dominant. In other words, when China's weak and Japan is a bit stronger. And I would characterise Japan as rather like Singapore in what they say and what they do are quite different. And I think the main difference now is Japan has been a little bit more vocal about their concerns about China, but they also have a very bad case of China's foreign interference, which they've been in deep denial about for a long time. I'm not sure if they're doing anything about it, but the LDP and all the political parties, I did an assessment of this in 2020, all their political parties have been targeted by CCP foreign interference. So that's a factor too. It's a big problem when your close partners have got a elite capture problem and they are not addressing it.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. This another question for Dr. Richardson from Major Jeremy Barraclough. I hope I can read this correctly. Ruth Benedict's consideration of Japanese culture during World War II and Chrysanthemum and the Sword, that's the name of a book I assume, that described a Japanese worldview of, quote, all ordered, unquote, under heaven. Is Shinzo Abe's political shifts a change in the Japanese worldview, or can they align?
Yeah, very tough question. It's a great. For anyone who's not familiar with this book, it was written by an American anthropologist, Ruth Benedict, and published in 1946. She did a lot of research on Japanese culture in Japan during the wartime years, and the book became very influential. Yeah, so I'm not sure if we can really draw parallels between that book. I mean, she highlighted a lot of the contradictions in Japanese society. But I think certainly we can understand Prime Minister Abe's worldview from a book he published called Utsukushi Kuni, Beautiful Country, where he was basically trying to, I guess, highlight this chrysanthemum side of Japan, by trying to detach Japan from that imperialist history and to paint a better, picture of Japan and to really move forward from that history. And part of that was to remove Japan from the shackles of that peace constitution, the pacifist constitution. It was really his main sort of objective was to change the constitution to allow Japan to have a more sort of normal defense posture, and for countries to stop criticizing Japan for its war legacy. That's partly why he has a bit of a controversial legacy, particularly in South Korea and China. But as I said in my talk today, although he didn't achieve that constitutional revision aim, and I think if he couldn't achieve it with such a long tenure, it's hard to imagine any succeeding Prime Minister could in the near future. But still, his legacy was that he did fundamentally change Japan's defence posture. I don't think he has effectively unshackled Japan from its history. There are still colonial victims alive in South Korea who are still waging battles for redress and compensation, and there's obviously some ill will still between China and Japan. But the book you mentioned is still quite influential, but I don't know to what extent we can connect that to Abe's worldview.
Thank you. The next question is another follow-up question from Major Jeremy Barraclough, this one to Professor Brady. Given the deficit of personnel volunteering to join or remain with the New Zealand Defence Force, the 30% gap I think that you mentioned, causing capability issues such as HMNZS Canterbury being non-mission capable. Is it time for democracies such as New Zealand to start talking of conscription? Is this, not sure if I can read this, is this contentious? Are there alternatives? Or can we continue our holiday from history? This question is very similar to about 7 other questions I've had, and I've just chosen this one as the one that's easiest to read. But several others have asked about this problem we have with personnel, how we generate the personnel. Australia is talking about trying to increase the size of its defence force. It's got massive gaps throughout the current defence force, let alone trying to expand it. And the thrust of several of the questions for both, and also for Senator Fawcett, are on this issue of how do we deal with our personnel problems. And that's someone else in one of the questions, I can't remember who asked us now, I think it might be that lady up there in the pink coat, asked a question about the looking at the various inquiries into things like post-traumatic stress disorder, how we treat our veterans. Is that not another factor? And how we treat other people. You've got to take into account the people with dementia and so on, the elderly people, and how we deal with this broader question of personnel issues. But I'll ask Professor Brady if you would like to start.
Okay, so in New Zealand what we've had is a problem of, I think this is off now, that's on again, yes. So it was attrition, 30% attrition from our existing Defence Force, which is the total figure of the Defence Force from memory, recent looking at, I think it was 15,000, so that's a big drop just in the COVID years. And so the problem is recruiting to get us back to the previous level, as well as we need more than that too, just like the Australian Defence Force, and it's been a topic of conversation in your media this very week. So, you know, one of the the Defence Forces in New Zealand and Australia always have to think about the job market and what it's like. Well, here's a plus about going into recession. Suddenly jobs in the Defence Force look attractive. But they have to look attractive, so more attractive in terms at least in the pay. And I remember hearing a couple of years ago people saying to me that our military personnel just love their overseas deployments, and that was sort of said, you know, with an eye roll, like, yeah, they just love going up into conflict zones. And they do, actually, some of them. But part of the reason was they got time and a half, at least, plus other benefits. They just needed that supplement to their salaries. And and they don't have a union, they're not allowed to unionise. And so they're just reliant on our politicians understanding their situation. And there's a real frustration in the Defence Force. I know I go and teach them, give courses to them regularly, and people are in touch with me too. And I think they're very long suffering, really. So this is a tiny start, the increase in pay that they're going to get in the new budget, and plus they've all got about $10,000 extra at Christmas as a bonus, but still the salaries are not equivalent to what people could get immediately after COVID years, when we had a real shortage of personnel because we weren't yet letting people come in from overseas. And just like Australia, so many of our jobs were being filled by there was the backpackers, but there were all sorts of people who were coming in, and then very large numbers of those people were sent home or went home at the beginning of the COVID years. And so now we're coming into recession, and I predict that the Defence Force is going to look more attractive. But what can you do about those advanced positions? People with advanced technology knowledge, for example, who've moved into the private sector. I don't have the answer for that, but I do know that pay and conditions is really, really crucial. And also that sense that your society values you and understands what you do. And this has been a problem in New Zealand. We were champions of people in New Zealand, including myself as a young person in the 1980s and long before that, since the French nuclear tests started and the British doing their nuclear tests in Australia and elsewhere in the Pacific. China also did nuclear tests in the North Pacific, the US. In New Zealand, as in Australia, there was a big movement against nuclear weapons, and my government and our people collectively agreed and supported our government to pass legislation in 1987. And I don't think that that many people in our society today in New Zealand really think about it, but our politicians are worried about it because they think the public won't like it if they change it. And part of that movement also led, and the anti-Vietnam War movement was part of that too, of not having that degree of appreciation for our people in service, as we heard about General Blamey and that 300,000 people coming out in the streets in Melbourne, and I can well imagine that. But we just don't have that in our society, our societies at the moment, that appreciation and awareness of the sacrifice and service that our servicemen and women make. And I think that the lack of public conversation about national security is part of the problem in that. I've spent a bit of time in the Baltic states, in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and in Czechia as well. And the conversation is a bit different about people in the military service. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for that question.
So I'll just quickly cover up. There's a number of vectors to this problem. Partly it's about increasing the size of the pool we can recruit from. Just to take aircrew as an example, if you're colourblind at the moment, or have a colour vision deficiency, it's the more technical name, you're not welcome to be aircrew in the Defence Force. Australia, some 30 years ago, actually led the world in terms of doing in-flight testing of people who'd failed the Ishihara test around colour vision deficiency and proved they could do all of the normal flight processes quite happily. The actual requirement for colour goes right back to the days of the Royal Navy and ships and the use of coloured lights, and before radios. That's why they required pilots to be able to see red and green to have landing or taking off, etc. These days, Bluetooth headsets, mobile phones, multiple radios, other ways. We fly aircraft on night vision goggles with monochromatic displays, essentially green and black, with no degradation to the ability to fly. CASA has now finally, having swapped 2 or 3 times, come back to allow civil pilots, so the captain of your 737 flying you somewhere in Australia may well have a colour vision deficiency. I'm encouraging Defence to broaden out, because that would increase the pool for aircrew by about 10%. Likewise, many of our fitness standards assume that you're going to be carrying a pack and a rifle, perhaps a couple of rounds for a mortar or something, and marching 20 kilometres. Many of our weapon systems these days are remotely operated stations where, to be honest, a millennial who's good with things that have got 55 buttons on them and looking at a display with multiple modes of information is probably going to be a better operator than many of us in this room. They could be a bit overweight, they may not be able to do all the fitness stuff, but they may be fantastic at that job. So we've got to change our thinking to actually say who would be good at this job and what do we really need them to be able to do. And the operation of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles or undersea vehicles, is a classic case in point where we get changed to thinking. Third, the narrative around the veterans' suicide. There are some people I talk to in the community who go, why would I let my child join the Defence Force? Because they will come out damaged. The reality is the vast majority of people who join the Defence Force have a fantastic career, learn a whole bunch of skills, are very fulfilled with the contribution they make to the nation, and move on successfully into a private sector or other career. Yes, there are some who are damaged physically or mentally by their service, but they are in the minority. That's not to diminish our responsibility to care for them and their families, but it is not the norm, it is not the majority's experience. So we need to make sure the narrative is not dissuading people from having a career. Some people also are concerned about physical abuse or bullying or sexual violence. One of the things I've tried to be at pains to highlight through Senate estimates and other inquiries into this is that the worst bullying practices in Australia are actually the nursing profession. The worst residential recruit training things are university colleges. And if you get bullying that happens at a military training, like the Navy's training, we had their CEO come in once and she said, the problem is their parents in their community have had them for 18 years, I've had them for 18 days, and something happens, how is it my fault? You know, and so there's a view where we need to put this into context and go, yep, it's bad, we should have a zero tolerance, but the military is not the causation factor for some of those behaviours. And yes, we need to work hard to make sure that people know there is zero tolerance to support those who have been affected, but we shouldn't allow the narrative to develop that the military is the problem, because in many cases it is not. Paying conditions, sure, there's always debates around that, particularly in high-tech areas. So people that we want to go and work in ASD, for example, they can double their salary with Google or some of those other companies. But what we find, and through the time I had on the Intelligence and Security Committee, where we work with the agencies around their retention and recruitment and other factors, often it is not the salary, it is actually the sense of duty to the nation, the leading edge technology, the mission is what brings people in. And they may only stay for 5 years, 6 years, and then the private sector attracts them out. But if we can make sure that we actually continue to work with that, and our recruiting should be as much about what is it that you can do for your country as it is, what can we add to you? Because my experience is that many people who are now leaving university or at university or high school are actually more motivated by that vision of mission, what's the purpose, what can I add, than they are about just the pure return. Not everyone, but enough that I think that's a real factor. And so I think there's a number of vectors there that we need to address to make sure that we get people. The last couple would be let people leave defence and come back into defence. I mean, we've had a massive change here in Australia in the last couple of decades, but I think it can actually be beefed up. And making sure that our rules and procedures around veterans, so serving members transitioning into civilian life, are in the favour, give the presumption of favour towards the veteran, and that we recognise the contribution of different groups. So we just finished a Senate inquiry, for example, into veterans sport. People think of Invictus Games and Warrior Games, etc., but there's actually a range of programs that work with veterans who have post-traumatic stress, whether it's horse riding or sailing. I do a lot of support for some of the sailing programs. We have some veterans who've been in their home for months, unable to leave because of social phobias. They do a sailing program, within a month or two they're engaged in the community, they're active, they're racing, they're whatever. And so some of those sports programs are really good, but they are not eligible for DVA funding often, because they're not necessarily an ex-service organisation doing advocacy work. And so this committee report, which was just handed down about a week ago, makes a number of recommendations in that space so that we can provide a more holistic and impactful support to both people who serve, to veterans, and to the support groups within community that actually want to help.
Thank you, David. I notice you very carefully sidestepped the issue of conscription. We might come back to that, but don't do it now.
Very happy to talk to subscription.
We'll come back to that a bit later if we've got time. Another issue with it also deals with Chinese coercion, more specifically though in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Again, I have a bit of trouble with the writing. India and China share a poorly defined border high in the Himalayas, which is well defended by both sides, and along which clashes occur periodically, most recently in 2020 and 2021, with some loss of life. A related issue is that China is continuing to use its Belt and Road Initiative to gain influence globally, not least in the Indian Ocean area. This is assisting China to establish a series of strategically located ports around the Indian Ocean, the so-called Chinese chain of pearls, which surround India. While these are primarily civilian ports, dual use, that is civil military, would be possible in most instances. While the only formal Chinese base so far is in Djibouti, Chinese interests control others such as Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea in Pakistan, and Ream Naval Base in Cambodia is being built by China and is another concern. The question is, how should Australia and India cooperate both directly and through the Quad to secure their lines of communication in the Indian Ocean and protect their trade to and from the North Arabian Sea, and more broadly to strengthen their joint regional interests? I think, Your Excellency, it might be a good opportunity for you to start.
Well, thank you for the question, and you've just reminded the audience about the border clashes just recently, 3 years ago, when there was aggression from China and an attempt to take over a slice of our territory up in the northern state of Jammu and Kashmir, in Ladakh specifically. So of all the, I would say perhaps of every country represented in this room or country of origin represented in this room, for all the other three Quad partners, we are the only one which shares a land border with China, and a very long one at that. It's thousands of kilometers. So for many people, while China is a threat or a potential aggressor, for us it's very up close and real. So we've actually had that periodically, attempts made by them to coerce us through such actions, military actions. We finally, I think there was a period of time when China was behaving somewhat more responsibly and focusing entirely on its economic modernization. I'm talking of, let's say, beginning with the Deng Xiaoping era, going into the 90s. And that led to, as I said, what was clearly a very responsible way of behavior with neighbors. And we had, for a very long period, we went to a war, an actual large war in 1962 with China, after which there was a cut-off of high-level contact, and we didn't restore ambassadorial level relations for a very long time, etc., etc. But finally, it was only in the early 1990s that we were able to actually work with China on what we call, it's three agreements on maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas without any prejudice to actual claims. So while we would still continue talks on delimitation of the boundary and dealing with that it's always a difficult issue, those matters, But the idea was that we would maintain peace and tranquility even while we spoke about that, and that peace and tranquility would allow normal relations, trade, commerce, investments, students, tourists, etc., to move. And that's exactly what happened. So for a very long time, much as many of the rest of the world, that is the direction in which a relationship with China proceeded. And then when they aggressed us in 2020, they actually tore up those agreements, written agreements, which had worked very well for both countries. They tore it up and did what they did or did what they tried to do. And we stood up to them. We sort of pulled up our socks. We, mustered all our resources. We got some assistance from some friends, but we were able to stop them in their tracks, as it were, and not allow them to do much more. So following that, what we have, and some of your earlier questions about the South China Sea, and what do you do in the South China Sea, these dialogue or codes of conduct, etc. In our case, frankly, there is complete strategic clarity now on China. And we've actually said and continue to say, and our ministers repeatedly say till today, even 3 years after those initial clashes, because while we are talking, and there have been, 24 rounds of negotiations and talks since those clashes, the Chinese haven't pulled back entirely. A few points they've pulled back a little bit. A few points they continue to be beyond where they ought to be. And so we've said it very clearly and publicly that it cannot be normal relations till there is restoration of the status quo ante. And so we've got that clarity. And the Chinese keep saying, oh no, let's go back and do all the other things, and we said, well, sorry, there is a limit now. What has also happened, and that's perhaps something that perhaps the Chinese may not have anticipated or realized, that notwithstanding what happens or what might happen even going forward, they've lost complete trust from 1.4 billion Indians. So there's just no trust left in that country. So while we don't know what the end game will be and how it'll pan out, and when they might restore the status quo ante or not, we are now convinced that if they can, if a responsible, large, or supposedly responsible, large country, permanent member of the Security Council, second largest economy with claims to doing wonders for the world, if they can tear up written agreements and do what it did, then we can no longer trust them. So we have to continue to build up. So we've built up our army, we've raised new mountain divisions, we've got extra gear, equipment. We are now up on those heights at 15,000, 16,000, 17,000 square feet, even in winter. Whereas there used to be an op alert period and a sort of a winter period when you would come down, the entire brigades would come down to peace stations, etc. Not any longer. So we are willing to take that. We are still a developing country. We have lots of resources that we need to devote to poverty alleviation and development. But we are willing to pay that price, which we are right now, to do more to make sure that the Chinese are deterred from any further coercion, etc. As regards the Belt and Road Initiative and the string of pearls around us, nobody can say we didn't want them, including our friends in Sri Lanka, etc. The attraction of the Belt and Road Initiative, the sort of easy money apparently that came with it, and the warnings that were ignored about how unsustainable this would all be. The result is quite clear, and I think there are today a lot more countries substantially more circumspect about the Belt and Road Initiative, about the real intentions, about the dangers from accepting too much from that particular country. And let's see how it goes forward. Securing sea lanes of communication, we'll simply have to continue to do what we are doing, do more of it. India and Australia, as I did say in my prepared remarks, we are doing quite a bit in terms of maritime surveillance. The Quad itself, one of its major projects, is on maritime domain awareness. So we hope very much that all of these would give us sufficient advance notice to make sure that our core interests, that our ships can sail, our commerce is not affected, the sea lanes of communication remain open. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that, Did you want to add anything? Okay. I now have a question from Ted Laney, and I think I can read it, Ted, if you're happy for me to do it. The Z's Belt and Road strategy makes certain smaller Indo-Pacific nations so dependent on Chinese investment that it negates ASEAN's possibilities for regional harmony and cooperation, and pushing back on foreign interference. I think, Ted, you would like Professor Brady and Dr. Teo to respond to that statement.
The question is, will it?
Oh, will it?
Yes.
Will it? Okay, sorry, I misread that.
Thank you for that question. Well, looking at the BRIs, it is very important to look at the detail. So, according to China's list of countries who've signed the Belt and Road, that's pretty much all the countries in the UN, about 165, I think. But that's not true. That's those who've had New Zealand that includes in their list. We've only had discussions about it, and that was part of a memorandum of agreement where what New Zealand really wanted was get the same FTA conditions that Australia got in 2015. We were talking to them about the upgrade of the FTA. In return for that, we talked about the Belt and Road. We're not talking anymore about it. We haven't talked to China about it since 2019. So there's the countries who did actually sign Belt and Road agreements. And then there's the list, much smaller, those who signed Belt and Road agreements and then had projects. So don't believe the hype, even though I am very concerned about Belt and Road, and we should be, about the agenda. We also should be looking carefully as to who did take the projects. And also, according to Chinese sources, New Zealand has a Belt and Road project. It's an ice cream factory in Pokeno, which is just outside Auckland, and I think that people there would be quite surprised to know that they were part of the Belt and Road. And you also have these entrepreneurial individuals who see all this money available and they want to pull down on that. This was the situation of Vanuatu, actually, in the port, historically important port of Espiritu Santos, which was important in World War II for launching the attacks against the Japan. And so Belt and Road is like lots of things to do with China. I call it the perfect storm because you've got a whole lot of things going on. It's not just Beijing and their agendas. Certainly it's had a big impact on countries like Pakistan in Southeast Asia. Pakistan's a really standout one, actually. It's a very bad case of Belt and Road. I just read a story from AP today reporting some very good research coming out of a research group in the US at William and Mary University, where they're looking at this extent of debt dependency of some countries, and China doesn't forgive their debts. So this is a real problem. I mean, some countries have very short, they've got very little cash available, and our governments are also, unfortunately, the aid that you give them, financial support, is going to pay off those debts because China's made itself the first creditor. In the Pacific, we have Tonga 42% in debt of GDP to China. Samoa is about 33%. In terms of our economies, New Zealand and Australia, we could probably afford to pay them off, and I think we should. That will alleviate a problem. I think we can do more about the Belt and Road in the Pacific. Unfortunately, it was New Zealand who encouraged China to think about the BRI in the Pacific back in the John Key administration, and they came to regret it very much. But luckily, there isn't, apart from PNG, there isn't a lot of BRI activity in the Pacific while there's been a lot of talk about it. But however, there was already existing debt. So it's not all about Beijing looking to destabilise the Pacific. There's some problems in different countries in the Pacific which make them much, much more vulnerable. And there is not a cross-Pacific solution to all of this. And I think Australia and New Zealand know this very well.
Could we pass that on to Sarah Teeley first?
Just while we're passing to Sarah, Australia is not immune. You may recall that Victoria signed up with the Belt and Road Initiative, and when the coalition was in government, we passed legislation giving the Foreign Minister the power to step in, and we have now torn up Victoria's 4 agreements they had, Belt and Road, and there was also, I think, one of Syria, and I think it was Iran was the other one that we tore up. The other thing I would say very quickly is sometimes we can use these things to our advantage. So the CCP built a hospital in Fiji, which was a not fit for purpose building, built and never used. We now have Aspen Medical under contract for the Fiji government, who have completely refitted. They're now doing full-on tertiary surgeries, open heart surgeries and things there. Because it's Australians who are managing it and running it, it is now known in the local community as the Australian Hospital.
Thank you, Mark. And Sarah?
Thanks for the question. So if I got the question right, it is about whether the dependence will challenge ASEAN's harmony, right? I think yes, there's definitely concern about the BRI projects in Southeast Asia. But I also think that, the fact is that many ASEAN countries or several Southeast Asian countries do need to build up their infrastructure. And China is one of the major partners in that effort. Right? So what ASEAN has tried to do, I think, is to kind of diversify some of its sources of investment or partnerships. So it does this through ASEAN initiatives. Like there's one called the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, or the Initiative for ASEAN Integration. So through that, I think ASEAN tries to kind of ensure that all the regional partners are somehow involved and contributing to that effort. And I do have colleagues, I think, back in my institution who examine how China's narrative of the Belt and Road is received in some ASEAN countries. And I think the findings are also that, that the way that China has portrayed its investment and its assistance as win-win or mutually beneficial, that has been received quite well by some ASEAN member states. But that said, there is also the other side of the coin, right, where China continues to be viewed with suspicion when it comes up with this initiative. But beyond the BRI, and I think beyond China's economic influence, I would say that ASEAN cohesion or unity is always a work in progress, right? The fact is that, it is made up of 10 different member states with 10 different sets of interests, which means you get 10 different sets of foreign policy and foreign relations. The challenge is really whether ASEAN can find areas of commonality, right? But then that then leads us into the problem that the areas of commonality that ASEAN can agree on are always issues that are very low-hanging, right? Everybody can agree that, yes, we want regional peace, we want regional stability, but how do we get there? I think that is where the difference lies. But I thought one way that ASEAN could or should, employ to get around this issue is really to employ a bit of creativity, right? So I'll give you an example. So like I mentioned in my talk earlier, in 2012, Cambodia, as the ASEAN chair, basically pulled the joint statement, right? Because it did not want to mention the South China Sea dispute. So in 2015, when the ADMM Plus met, so this was a meeting of 18 defense ministers, the same issue about whether to mention the South China Sea in the joint declaration came up, right? So this was hosted by Malaysia at the time. And the ADMM, I think, or ASEAN collectively took a decision that, okay, the ADMM Plus would not issue a joint declaration. So this was not because of any single ASEAN member states, but it was a joint decision by the ASEAN ministers not to issue a joint statement. But Malaysia would continue to issue its chairman's statement as the ASEAN chair. And in that statement, the concern about South China Sea was highlighted. So I think that's a way that ASEAN can hopefully try and work around the broader strategic tensions.
Thank you. I've got enough questions here that would keep us going for another hour, I'm sure, but we can't do that. We've got to wrap up in a couple of minutes. But there is one issue that several people were concerned about, and that's the reliability of the United States as an ally. This has partly been, I guess, arisen as a consequence of President Biden's decision 2 days ago to cancel his visit to Sydney and Papua New Guinea for the Quad leaders meeting and the Pacific Island meeting in New Guinea. It is being interpreted by some as Biden placing less importance on the US-Australia alliance than Australia does, but more broadly, there is deep concern at the state of the deeply divided American polity, the power of the extreme right-wing influence within the Republican Party, and the re-emergence of isolationist sentiments during the recent Trump presidency. And so the question is, how do you see the issue of American reliability as an ally in the context of ANZUS, the treaty, the Quad, the AUKUS agreement? And I think, Senator, you got the microphone.
So, I spoke in the Parliament probably a month ago, maybe 6 weeks. The Greens had moved a motion calling the AUKUS deal, can't remember the exact words, but a travesty, something really bad, and making all kinds of allegations about the United States and the foolishness in their view of our having an agreement or an alliance with them. If you read that speech, I go back and highlight the fact that it was actually during World War II when the British decided that they were distracted elsewhere and that we were largely left to our own devices. It was the Americans who answered the call, and young men and women came and served, and many laid down their lives for Australia, invested huge amounts into the security of this region, and have lifted many millions of people out of poverty in the region. The American people, writ large, still believe in freedom and in this contest between totalitarianism and freedom. They will back freedom any time. That said, it is true that their polity is more bifurcated now than it has been for many years, with more extreme positions on the left and the right, and they struggle in their Congress at times to find the common ground which they have traditionally been known for. It is true that President Trump was somewhat erratic at times and was quite focused on American isolationism at times. Having said that, he achieved a lot of objectives that his predecessors, even the Bushes, had not been able to achieve in terms of getting other allies to lift their spending on expenditure and pushing through. The problem was he smashed most things in the diplomatic china shop on his way through to achieve that. There are some concerns that as we look at the NTIB, the National Technology and Industrial Base legislation that John McCain was a great advocate for, and that was to include Australia and the United Kingdom into the orbit of how America saw its industrial base, therefore to be able to deal with our companies making things for them, as opposed to everything having to be made in America. And part of the reason that never went forward was that there was a pushback by a number of congressmen and senators saying, but that will actually take away America's sovereignty because we'll have to rely on other people, and opposing it. So now we're looking at AUKUS, that same question has arisen, and what you're seeing is a range of people, both within the Congress, Joe Courtney and others, in the last couple of weeks, bills being put forward to say, no, we must actually recognise that sharing information with Australia is beneficial. But I think the most encouraging thing is William Greenwald, who was Under Secretary under the Trump administration, now the Atlantic Council, has written a couple of papers around the need for ITAR reform, not for the benefit of Australia or the UK, but because he has recognised that unlike the 1950s, where America really did lead the world in technology and they had to protect it against the Soviets and others, now many of the innovations are occurring in the corporate sector and in nations other than America. And because of the ITAR constraints, there is now a thing that is known as ITAR taint, where companies and countries are saying, we do not want the Americans to have any involvement in this because we don't want ITAR taint on our intellectual property. And Greenwald's argument, which is being well received in Washington, is that it's actually hurting the United States. So I see that increasingly, and particularly now, as General Mattis called out the fact that America was no longer capable of winning 2 wars and containing a third. He said we could win 1 and contain a second. They face the very real reality of a conflict in Europe, a conflict in the Middle East, and a conflict, possibly 2, merging into one big one, in the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea. They need their allies. And as I spoke about before in terms of supply chain, they need allies to help them with critical minerals, with semiconductors, with production of precision-guided munitions and other things that they need to sustain their big stick, their capability. So yes, disengagement is always a concern, and that's been a debate in Australia for decades as to whether we're going to be essentially entrapped with the Americans, who may well suddenly turn isolationist and leave us hanging. But I think history has shown that they believe as a people in the rightness of freedom and democracy and the rights of the individual to the extent where they will step up. They have done in the past, they are again now in Ukraine, and I believe that they will continue to do so.
Thank you very much. That will bring this session to a close. I'd like you to join with me in thanking all our panel.
Folks, I'm aware that it's been a very long day. Thank you for your patience, but I do need to make a quick summary of some thank yous that are essential and a couple of points that I hope you'll be willing to take away with you. Could I set the scene by reminding you that Australia as an economy is the same GDP as Russia. And it seems to me that when we look at the Russian military versus the Australian military, we have to understand that it is a social choice. And one of the issues that I hope people are taking away is that in a democracy, it is our responsibility to talk to our leaders and to show them that we do or do not support some view. And I'd like to finish today by both thanking some people and making some points that I think are absolutely essential. And one of the points that may have struck you is how important it is for critical leadership at a particular time in a country's evolution. If there wasn't a Putin, we may well not have had the Ukraine situation. If there wasn't a Xi, we may not have had the current CCP situation, which that very careful point that was made by the Senator. And at a time when it seems to me that our Prime Minister is, in a sense, very inclined to show that leadership,
with bipartisan support from the opposition. This is a really important time for our democracy and us as individuals to say to our leaders, we support this and we believe this is appropriate, or whatever your view happens to be. So in that context, I'd like to firstly say thank you because it's important, and I'd like to particularly acknowledge and thank, and in fact I'd just ask if they could stand up because they've done a terrific job, Ron Lyons, Kim Turner, Paul Irving, and they were ably assisted by Theo, who's right up the back and invisible, but nevertheless I can see you, Theo, John Howells, who's done our AV, and Alan Smith. Could you just join me in thanking them? I'd like to particularly also say thanks to our Blamey Oration representative. Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for your contribution and very thoughtful message. And I'd like to also, just on everybody's behalf, just say how much we appreciated the sponsorship that John provided. If you look at your program on the back of the second page, the reason why many of you are able to be here and enjoy the day in a financial sense for free, you had some lunch, that was great, I hope you enjoyed it. But we actually got sponsorship from both the Department of Defence and from Mr. John Leece. And I wonder, John, if you wouldn't mind standing so we could acknowledge you, and thank you so much. I'd like to make my concluding comments addressed to the serving ADF and younger members of our audience, because I wonder if you were struck, as I was, by the Senator's comments that this could be something that is affecting you with the equipment you currently have within the next 3 to 4 years. Could I remind you that in that pantheon of excellent presentation and speakers that we have just appreciated and enjoyed, some really key points were made. It's about culture, it's about people, and it's about a range of things. And the things that, for example, I'd like to focus your attention on is that my son is a PWO, and Navy people understand that, and PWOs are like we armour people, or artillery people, or infantry people. That lot behind us, the biscuit carriers or the deliverers of the food. Could I remind you, please, of the really key point that was made, particularly by the Senator, logistics. And so could I urge that one culture that you might need to deliberately drive through your system is not the glamour people up the front. It is a whole system, and it's really important that you focus on the aspects that we've just heard. Could I just round off by saying, I hope that you were impressed as I was by the superb delivery and the wide range of knowledge of the speakers and the fluent way that they delivered it. And on everybody's behalf, could I say to the panel of speakers, we have had the privilege of a superb range of presentations, an excellent example of how to present. I would have said to the departing His Excellency, I don't think ChatGPT could have generated up a better speech. Some of you would be aware of what I was trying to say there. And in very broad terms, look at the technology change of what we're facing in simple things like ChatGPT. As a university professor, I have to learn how to deal with that technology. As a serving member of the ADF, so do you. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I declare that the international dialogue is closed. Thank you.